Hi, I'm Shelly Owens with Go Be Love, and I'm back with our second installment of our Mission Accomplished video series. So, before we really dive into this series, I want to first make sure that we're on the same page with our terminology. I want today to talk about this phrase that often gets thrown around when we talk about the countries to where we're sending short term teams. And this is a phrase that I don't love and I don't use, and I won't be using throughout this series. And here is this phrase. I wrote it down for you: third world country. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of that phrase and explain why it's inaccurate, it's outdated, and it's really offensive to people who live in those countries. But what I'm also going to do is give you a really great alternate phrase that I'll be using throughout this series and that hopefully you can start using as well. So I'll just dive in by saying third world country. That's a phrase that was coined in the 1950s during the Cold War. A French historian wrote this widely known dissertation where he lumped all the countries in the world into three categories. The first world was the US, Western Europe, and our allies. The second world was what would have been the communist bloc at the time: the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, their allies. And then everybody else just got lumped into the third world. So, because most of the countries that were categorized as third world countries were poor countries, that term third world country over time just became synonymous with poor country. So, right out of the gate, we can see that that's inaccurate because, a really wealthy country like Saudi Arabia that doesn't identify with the West, that doesn't identify with the communist bloc, would technically, in this organization, be considered a third world country. It's also outdated. There's a lot more dynamics going on in the world today than just, the West versus communism. That's not really a current way to define our world. But the main reason I don't love that term, third world country, is because it implies this hierarchy between countries, as if the first world sort of has attained the ideal in every way, and everybody else is just trying to catch up to us. It disrespects and ignores the fact that there are highly developed and sophisticated things happening in a lot of these so-called third world countries. For example, the country in East Africa that I used to live in is Uganda. And that's a country where there's very few social safety nets for very few people. For most people, there's no such thing as health insurance or welfare or workers' compensation. In America, if you're injured at work, you're probably going to have access to some level of workers' compensation, and the government will take care of you. In a country like Uganda, if you're injured at work and you truly cannot work, your community will step in and take care of you. Your literal village of people that live in the houses or the huts right around you are going to step in and take care of you and your family and your home, because that's just the way their society works. And I have to say, I find that practice incredibly developed and sophisticated. So, this idea of third world country ignores that whole aspect, that whole dimension of this whole group of countries. So let me tell you about an alternate phrase. And I was introduced to this phrase when I lived on the mission field, and I love it. I wrote this one down for you too. Majority world country. Now, what I love about that phrase, majority world, is that it defines these countries on the mission field in terms of what they are rather than what they lack. They truly are the majority of the world. These countries, these third world countries, represent the vast majority of humanity. I don't know how many Americans are aware that 85% of the people in the world live on $10 a day or less. Or how about this one? Even people who live at the poverty line in America are among the top 14% of the global income distribution. And that's a fancy way of saying even people who live in America who are really, really poor are really wealthy by the world standards. So why am I bothering telling you all of this? Well, number one, because I really do want us to be on the same page with our terminology. I want you to understand throughout this series what I'm talking about and where I'm talking about when I refer to a majority world country. But really more importantly, it's because this is going to frame a lot of the conversation that we'll have throughout the rest of this series. It's very important for Americans, and this is a really common mistake that Americans make when they go to the mission field. It's really important for us to understand how wealthy we are, how high our standard of living is compared to the rest of the world. It's important to understand that most people in the world do not live like we do in America. And I'm not really here to judge or to say one is right and one is wrong, but it's important when you go to the mission field to have the discernment to understand what is really poverty, what is need, what is lack, and what is just not American. So that's it for today. I'll be back probably later this week to start talking about some of the problems that we tend to encounter when we send short-term mission teams to a majority world country. Make it a great day from the Go Be Love team. Thanks for tuning in.